Hi again, everyone. I cannot tell you how excited I am about both of our closing speakers. I had the opportunity to talk to each of them in advance of this conference, and I was blown away by their ideas and powerful messages. I hope you'll take time to read the letter Justice Montoya-Lewis and her colleagues wrote. It is in the files section for this session. They close by saying, "We go by the title of justice, and we reaffirm our deepest level of commitment to achieving justice by ending racism." When I read this, I knew we had chosen the right person for this time. To introduce Justice Montoya-Lewis, we have an incredible advocate from the Justice's home state. Amelia Watson is a managing attorney with the Washington State Office of Public Defense for Parents Representation Program. Amelia is a founding member of the National Alliance for Parent Representation, an executive member of the Family Justice Initiative, a founding stakeholder advisor for the Washington State Parent Ally Committee, and an advisory member for the Washington State's Children's Justice Task Force. Amelia?
Thank you, Mimi. As a parents representation attorney from Washington State, it's a true honor to be able to introduce Justice Raquel Montoya-Lewis today. She was first appointed to the Washington State Supreme Court in 2019 and was reelected in 2020. Prior to serving on Washington's highest court, she had extensive academic as well as judicial experience in both state and tribal jurisdictions. I also noted from her bio that she holds both a Juris Doctorate in Law and a Master of Social Work degrees. She is an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Isleta and a descendant of the Laguna Indian tribe, two federally recognized tribes from New Mexico. Justice Montoya-Lewis was on Washington's Supreme Court last summer after the murder of George Floyd. And as Mimi mentioned, she, along with the other justices, issued a letter to Washington's judiciary and the legal community. I, too, would urge you to read that letter. That letter urged us all to join their deepest level of commitment to achieving justice by ending racism. It was a calling to many of us, and a number of impactful decisions have followed. Recently, the court found Washington's simple drug possession law unconstitutional. And in another case, they supported the right of an incarcerated parent to meaningfully participate in their termination of parental rights trial. In another, Justice Montoya-Lewis authored a unanimous decision which held a trial court has reason to know that a child is an Indian child when a participant indicates that the child has tribal heritage, thus assuring protections under ICWA and Washington's WICWA. And just yesterday, the court reversed a termination of parental rights finding that the state did not truly offer services given the mother's intellectual disability. There are so many child welfare decisions that we've been reading in Washington from them. These and many other decisions have given parent representation folks hope to truly imagine a society with an appetite for justice and dignity. Washington's Supreme Court is considered the most diverse Supreme Court in the United States. And many of us now imagine the court having conversations that look and feel different and truly reflect the communities of Washington State. We in Washington State Parents Representation are listening and leaning in and hopeful. And I am so excited that this community of all of us today have the opportunity to listen and lean in and hope. Please join me in welcoming Justice Montoya-Lewis.
Thank you, Amelia, for that beautiful introduction. I really appreciate the way you introduced the work that we're doing on the court as work where we are really hoping to accomplish justice. And what I'd like to do today in this closing plenary, and I welcome all of you that are watching to this closing plenary, and I'm very grateful for your time and attention. And what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about why stories matter and why the stories that you tell as parent representatives and others involved in working with families in crisis, why those stories are critical, and why judicial leadership and leadership from communities and lawyers who help to tell these stories is so important as we move through cases where we are serving families. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some of, so that I can kind of illustrate what it means to me when I talk about storytelling. And I'm calling this plenary leadership and storytelling, because for me, as a Native person, those two things go hand in hand. I am not someone who viewed myself at any point in my career as being someone who would sit on the bench. It was not something I envisioned. And certainly being on a Supreme Court seemed wildly out of reach. When I went to law school, I had never met an attorney. I'd never spoken to one. I'd never spoken to a judge. And so where I sit today is a place that I sit with what I hope is humility, and what I expect of myself is a high degree of telling those stories exactly as Amelia described in the group of 9 when we are talking about cases. And what I want to know when I am working on cases, whether they are child welfare cases, as we've done so much work in recently, or criminal cases, or really any case, is the story. How did this case get to us? And certainly as a legal nerd, I'm interested in the civil procedure of how things got to us. But I'm particularly interested in the story of the people behind these cases. So I want to talk about why that matters. And the reason that I think that matters is because of the way that I came into the practice of law and my educational process in law school. When I went to law school, driven by by wanting to understand how the institution of law impacted people. And I certainly learned the theory of how the law works, why it works the way it does. But I wasn't really hearing the stories behind the cases that we read. And I was frankly baffled by that, because I was raised in a tradition of communicating through story. And I don't mean necessarily through myth, although that was certainly part of how I was raised, but through communicating stories of our history. And I expected to hear some of those stories. And in my first year of law school, it became immediately clear that not only were those stories not being told, but there was tremendous resistance to the idea that telling stories might be relevant. And it was frankly my primary means of communication. I was very lucky at the time that I entered law school in the early 90s that a discussion about narrative and legal storytelling was very vibrant. And I was lucky enough to be able to read some of the work by Delgado and Stefanik, whose very important quote is at the top of this slide. And also be able to meet and talk with others who were working in critical race theory, working in narrative as a means of legal storytelling. And that spoke to me because it was, as I said, the way I was raised to tell stories. And it was the way for me to get at the crux of what is important in a case. So some of you may be familiar with John Hodgman. He's a comedian, a writer, and he has a podcast called Judge John Hodgman, where he decides ridiculous cases that are where he is creating what he calls internet law. But he often says specificity is the soul of narrative. And I have taken that to heart as a judge and as a storyteller, because as he often points out, and as many writers have pointed out, the better we are at communicating the stories that we want judges and community members to hear, and the stories that the families we work with need us to hear, the more specific we are, the better we get at serving justice. So I'm just going to briefly refer to the letter that Amelia talked about, that the Supreme Court issued on June 4th, and it's in the files, and there's also, you can also just Google it and you will find it. The letter was one that all 9 of us signed and all 9 of us committed to. I'm not going to tell you today that all of us do this all of the time. The way we come at how to address these issues is complicated. Being the most diverse court in the country means that we have tough conversations with each other because we bring very different perspectives, very different experiences to our conferences, to our cases, to our discussions, and it's hard work. But when that work is hard, as Justice Johnson, who's the longest serving justice on our court now, and he's been on our court for about 30 years, he often reminds us that we are at our best when we are in disagreement and when we are struggling to understand one another. And so when I read the June 4th letter, I often go back to this paragraph. The legal community must recognize that we all bear responsibility for this ongoing injustice, and that we are capable of taking steps to address it if only we have the courage and the will. The injustice still plaguing our country has its roots in the individual and collective actions of many, and it cannot be addressed without the individual and collective actions of us all. What's most important to me in that paragraph, in those few sentences, is that it requires our commitment, and that if we have that commitment, we are capable of making great change. So part of my commitment to making that change is to empower others to tell their stories, whether it's their own stories or their stories that they need to tell and communicate on the part of the families that they are working with. I know, as after having sat on child welfare cases over the last 20 years as a tribal court judge and as a state court trial judge, that the more information I had, the better informed I was, the better decisions I made. And it was absolutely my experience in the first 15 years of being a judge and working on child welfare cases, primarily on those cases in tribal courts, that in the tribal court system, I had access to a great deal more information than I had when I was a state court judge. That difference was very striking to me. And it was very striking to me because it made me realize that the job of a tribal court judge is very much informed by the community's values. It was expected of me as a tribal court judge that I would not just understand the individual family members that were in front of me in a child welfare case, but that I understood the role of each of those individual tribal members in our community, that I understood not just this family, but their generations before them, and not just to this family, but the role this family served in the tribal community. And in our tribal communities, the word family is very broad. I often confuse my non-native friends when I use the word cousin or brother or sister interchangeably. They are interchangeable words for me. When I talk about grandparents, sometimes I'm talking about blood relatives, often I'm not. And those kinship relationships for us really mean as much as any biological connection does. So I learned over the course of those 15 years working in various tribal communities, some in New Mexico, many in the Pacific Northwest, that was really something you could say was true of all tribal communities, that our kinship stories are wide-ranging, that they include our our blood family members and beyond, and that those relationships are based not just upon biological connection, but upon kinship connection, upon the idea of who we understand to be our family members. And I think that's largely a result of much of our history as well as our community values. And when I came into the state court system and began to sit on child welfare cases as a state court judge, the information I had access to, the information I was allowed to have access to, and even the information I could seek from the bench was very limited by our statutes, very limited by the practice of child welfare law that I saw in the courts I worked in. And that was something that I frankly found to be a fairly difficult shift to make. And so I began to think a great deal about what does that mean for me as a judge in the state court system, and at the time as the only Native judge in the state court system at any level. It gave me an opportunity to bring the way I did child welfare cases in other jurisdictions into the state court. And it also made me think about the importance of preserving and ensuring that people understood why storytelling, why my drive to understand the families in front of me motivated me so much and where it came from. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about my own family story. This is just a piece of my family story, but it is, I think, illustrative of what I hope those of you who represent parents and those of you who work with families in crisis become committed to learning about the people that you are working with. So this is my great-great-grandmother, Tsachma. She was a Laguna tribal member. She's seen in this photograph that was taken in the late 1800s in traditional Laguna clothing. In fact, if you go back and watch Secretary Deborah Holland, who is now the Secretary of the Interior and the first Native cabinet member in the history of our country, being ready to be sworn in to that position, you'll actually recognize some of the clothing that you see Tsachma wearing as clothing that Secretary Holland was wearing. These our culture and traditions at Laguna and at Isleta are very much intact. And for many of my relatives in both Laguna and Isleta, the tribal languages, which are different between the two tribes, were the primary and first languages that many of my relatives learned to speak. We have a very stable history because we were not moved. Many of the tribes, if not all of the tribes that I have worked with outside of the state of New Mexico, are tribes that were relocated. And the loss and damage that those kinds of relocations by the federal government created is loss that continues to impact current generations. This is my great-great-grandfather, Jose Paisano. So he was married to Tsachma. One of the things you'll note is that Tsachma is, I refer to her by her tribal name, but in the same time frame, many Native people were going by names that were given to them at first contact, and after that, when conquistadors from Spain, as well as government officials from the United States, couldn't pronounce the tribal names. And so they were given names that are often Spanish sounding, as my name is. And so you begin to see that shift from traditional tribal names to Americanized names. And you see that in the census. Censuses have been taken over the course of the last 250 years. In the earlier census you'll see names that include both, and in the current census, you will see those names drop off. My great-great-grandparents were raised and lived their lives at Laguna. But my great-grandmother was sent from Laguna to Pennsylvania to Carlisle boarding school. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the history of boarding schools in this country and the forced removal of children from their families and their homes and their home communities and sent to boarding schools. Carlisle was a boarding school run by Richard Pratt. His motto was "Kill the Indian and save the man." He ran his boarding school based upon a military structure. Boys were trained to be soldiers. The girls were trained to be maids, servants in houses, and many of them were adopted out from Carlisle boarding school to become servants and maids to white families in various communities directly out in Pennsylvania, right out of Carlisle boarding school, or sent to other states. This is another place where we see tremendous generational loss that impacts families that we work with today. This is a photograph of Pueblos entering Carlisle in 1880 or so. And you may not be able to see my cursor very well, but this young woman who is wearing what you'll see sort of a white tie or bow at the top of her dress, that is my great-grandmother, Mary Perry. This is a photograph taken early on in her time at Carlisle. She was there from between 4 to 6 years. The records are a little unclear. And they were very rigorous at Carlisle at documenting before and after photographs. You can find hundreds of these. If you look in Carlisle's archives, you can see them. And this is a before picture that was taken when Mary Perry came in to Carlisle. And the two young boys with her are also Laguna tribal members. One of them's name is Ben Thomas, and the other is John Chavez. This is the after photograph that was taken several years later. And Mary Perry returned to Laguna and married William Paisano. William Paisano and Jose Paisano were both governors of the Pueblo of Laguna. They were in New Mexico, most tribal leaders are referred to as governors. In your communities, if you have tribes locally, they're often called chairpersons, chairs, or chairmen of tribes. My father went to Albuquerque Indian School, a boarding school that was closer to Isleta, he went there because both of my grandparents taught there. My grandmother, one of many children of William Paisano and Mary Perry, were sent voluntarily by Mary Perry and her husband to a boarding school in Kansas. Both my grandparents, my grandfather from Isleta, met my grandmother there, and both of them became teachers in these boarding schools. So we went from my family members being forcibly removed from their communities to, upon their return, their decision to send their children to those schools. There's a lot of complexity behind that decision, but I have many letters written by my great-grandmother that talk about her frustration at being unable to successfully convert people in her community from their tribal religion to Christianity, which she had been taught was the way to heaven. And she was raised there at Carlisle in the Christian faith and came back believing that the traditions and customs of her tribe were the traditions and customs of devil worshipers. And there are letters that you see her write back to Carlisle boarding school to Colonel Pratt, in which she describes her frustration at being unable to successfully have her community make that transition. It's deeply painful for me to read those letters because you see this internalized hatred that she has learned and been taught about who she is and about who her community is. So when my father got to Albuquerque Indian School, and he was, as I said, sent there by my grandparents who taught at Albuquerque Indian School as well as at other schools. My father had sort of learned that the way to survive was to speak English, and to survive in an environment where what he was being taught was that who he was shameful. My father didn't talk about this period of his life in much detail. After he left Albuquerque Indian School, he went to a Catholic high school where he was routinely beaten for speaking his language. And so he really struggled with teaching me mine, because for him, learning and speaking the Tiwa language, which is the primary language spoken at Isleta, it was dangerous, and he didn't want to expose me to the harm that he had experienced. My father joined the military out of high school and went to college as part of the ROTC, and then went into the Air Force as an officer. And he spent a career working as an engineer for the U.S. Air Force. This is a photograph of my father and my mother. My mother is Australian. It's a long story about how the two of them met. And so she was an immigrant. So I also have a story of immigration to this country as part of my own history. This photograph shows me on one of several important days of my life where I received membership in a clan at Isleta and my language, my name in my tribal language. Sorry. So that brings me to where I am today and what I want to briefly talk about in terms of storytelling. I had the privilege of writing a case on the Indian Child Welfare Act, and the name of the case is at the top with the docket number and date if you'd like to read the case in its entirety. And I was really struggled with, do I use this opportunity to tell this story? And do I use my position as a Supreme Court justice to begin to use legal storytelling and opinions? And if I do I do that in a case involving Native people, or do I do that in some other case? My fear being that people might read this case and say that because of who I am, I was biased in a certain direction in this case. And that was certainly something that my opponent in my election used against me routinely. It really came down, obviously, as you can see from the paragraph, this is the first paragraph of the case ZPG, to recognize that it was critical that I tell this story, because there is no one else in a position like me to tell this story about Native communities and the impact of systems of child welfare, adoption in boarding schools and other institutions, there are many, that separated Native children from their families and tribes. And I wanted to emphasize, as you can see here, that this history is a living part of tribal communities with scars that stretch from the earliest days of this country to its most recent ones. I'm just going to show you a couple of photographs as I get to some of my concluding remarks from the day that I was sworn into my position as justice. It was a long way from where we started with the earliest photograph I showed you of Fatima, who was born in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, to this day. And one of the things I said when I was sworn in is that it had become immediately clear to me the very first time I walked up the steps of the Washington State Supreme Court's Temple of Justice and walked into those doors, and this was long before I became a Supreme Court justice or even imagined it to be possible. But those steps in that building were not built with someone like me in mind. With someone coming from a fairly working class, lower middle class background, someone who had never met a lawyer before they went to law school, and someone with a family story like mine. And I really had to think about, before I even applied for the appointment, whether I was ready to be that first voice on the court. And when I accepted the appointment to this position, I realized that the only way I could be a Supreme Court justice in this court, in this role as the first Native woman to sit on this bench, the first Native person to sit on this bench, that I had to make the courthouse feel like it was welcome to people like me, not just to me, but to people like me. So on the left side, you see me receiving the feather that you can see on the desk when I'm signing my oath of office that was given to me by a group of singers that I asked to be a part of the ceremony. And I was honored to have them there from the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe. I also was honored to have Fawn Sharp, who is the president of the National Congress of the American Indians and has been the chairwoman of the Quinault Indian tribe and was one of my law school peers, introduced me at the beginning of the swearing-in ceremony. And at the end of the ceremony, it's traditionally closed with a benediction, and I had Rabbi Seth Goldstein from Temple Beth Hatfiloh in Olympia, where the court is located, do that benediction so that I could bring in all sides of who I was. The point of doing that for me was not to have the day be about me, but to have the day be about the families and communities that I had spent my career serving. It was critical to me that I come in as someone who recognized that the seat I sit in on that bench is a seat that I sit in to hold for others who will follow me. It's not my seat. It is the people's seat. And I'm there, I hope, to bring life to some of these stories. But I cannot do it without you. I cannot do that without knowing what those stories are. And what I've learned over the course of my 18 months or so on this bench is that by the time these cases get to me, if I don't have a clear record, if I don't have a clarity about what led to families and children in dependency cases coming to this court, I'm very limited in what I can understand from that point forward. All I have is the record. All I have is what you tell me, what you tell your judges. And thus, judicial leadership and community leadership is critical. This last photograph shows me and Justice Mary Yu on the top left. Justice Yu is the third person in from the left. And I visited Spokane right before we went on lockdown. And I was lucky enough to meet with many community members there. The photograph on the top right was a photograph that was taken, and I'm really grateful to Justice Yu for taking this photograph. The woman at the very back is the mother of the young woman that I'm meeting in this photograph. And Davina, this young woman, told me in this moment that seeing me in this position made her think that it was possible for her to be in that position someday. And so this photograph at the bottom is not the most current photograph of the court because we now have Justice Helen Whitener, but it's the most recent photograph we have. And because we haven't been able to assemble to get a full picture since Justice Wiggins retired. So I'm just going to end our screen share there and invite you to continue to think about how you can tell the courts what the stories are behind the people that you work with and what you might do to get to know those stories. My experience has been that the best way to do that is to tell your own stories. And so I hope that some of what I've been able to share with you today about my family history, and I said it's just a slice, gives you some curiosity about what you might learn about your families and how you got to where you are. The trauma that many of my family members, right up through my own story, have experienced informs the way that we see the world, informs the way that we interact with institutions like the legal system, the healthcare system, many other systems that the families that came in front of me were expected to interact with without skepticism and without fear, and with a belief that the intention was to reunify them with their children and to reunify families. That wasn't always the case, and so their skepticism was well-founded. My job as a judge was to try to overcome some of that skepticism, but I could never do that if I didn't know who they were. I read a quote today that I'm going to close with that really struck me. It was written by Dr. Thema Bryant Davis, who's a well-known writer on trauma and racism and many other subject areas. And she says, "Don't confuse who you had to become with who you actually are." The last thing I'll say with respect to that and why it spoke to me is because I think we often talk about communities like mine by talking about resilience. And certainly resilience and survival are the things that gave rise to me to be able to speak to you today from the position of power that I sit in. And resilience is a positive thing in many respects, but it also has a tendency to undercut what actually happened and what that means in terms of the trauma that people have survived. So I invite you to listen to this one more time, and then I will turn it over to our next speaker. Don't confuse who you had to become with who you actually are. Thank you for your time and attention today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you.
Justice Montoya-Lewis, thank you so much for being here at our closing plenary. And I just wanted to share a couple of messages that came in the chat directly to you. The first said, my great-grandfather was a student and a graduate of the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And I think that participant felt a real connection to you as you were telling your story. Another person said, we need to know each other's histories in order to understand the specific ways in which trauma is still manifesting in communities today. But learning these histories will reveal the strengths that persist as well. And finally, Justice Montoya-Lewis, thank you for speaking truth to power. Never back down and never let the haters make you think twice about your right to speak out because of your heritage. It is your heritage that gives you the moral authority to do so. So thank you for inspiring all of us and sharing some time with us today. And now to introduce our closing speaker, I will turn us over to Caitlin Becker. Caitlin is the Managing Director of Social Work at the Bronx Defenders. She's also the co-chair of the National Alliance for Parent Representation Interdisciplinary Model Subcommittee and a friend to all of us and especially to Dr. Tricia Stephens. So Caitlin.
Thank you, Mimi. I am overwhelmed with gratitude to be with all of you today and to be surrounded by the inspiring colleagues we've heard from over the past 2 days. It is my honor to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Tricia Stephens. I can't imagine a more fitting end to the important conversations we've had throughout this conference. Last May, Dr. Stephens spoke at a virtual gathering to mark what would have been our second National Interdisciplinary Family Defense Conference in Denver. She began her remarks with the words of Ella Baker. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Dr. Stephens went on to describe the historical context to America's appetite for family separation, an appetite that we as family defenders bear witness to every day. Dr. Stephens joined the faculty at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College as an assistant professor in the fall of 2015. She earned her doctoral degree from New York University, Silver School of Social Work, and completed her pre-doctoral fellowship at the NYU McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. In a field where social workers are used to police, prosecute, and permanently destroy families, Dr. Stephens has been a critical voice. She resists the narratives about broken homes and bad parents, too often perpetuated by the family regulation system. Through her clinical work, research, and scholarship, Dr. Stephens has gotten to know parents impacted by the family regulation system. She has come to know their pain, their trauma, their power, and their resilience. She has come to family court and witnessed firsthand as parents walk in hoping to get their children back and walk out without them. She has watched what she calls the routine devastation of families in a court system not intended to help them. While our field believes itself to be adopting a trauma-informed lens, Dr. Stephens reminds us of the systemic and historical trauma that white supremacy and racism has inflicted on Black, Indigenous, and families of color in this country. Fueled by a firm belief in the power and possibility of recovery and healing from intergenerational trauma, Dr. Stephens challenges the system to see parents as they truly are, persistent and brave, and with deep love for their children. They are not broken, she has told us. They are not fragile or vulnerable. They do not need to be fixed. They need to be heard, listened to, valued, and allowed to raise and care for their children without the watchful eye of the police state. I am grateful that Dr. Stephens has agreed to join us and share her reflections with our incredible National Family Defense community today. Dr. Stephens?
Thank you, Caitlin. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, and it is my pleasure to be here once again. I open with the similar words, but this time I want you to hear the song and hear it directly from the singers, Sweet Honey in the Rock. We who believe in freedom shall not rest. Ella's song.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Hear me talking to you. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of Black men, Black mother sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mother sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Sing it with me if you like it. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. The older I get, the better I know that the secret of my going on is when the reins are in the hands of the young who dare to run against the storm. 'Cause to me, young people come first. They have the courage where we fail. And if I can but shed some light, I say, carry us through the gales. We who believe in freedom cannot rest.
Tribe. And I call you my tribe because every time I come to these spaces, I find the people who see with their eyes, choose to see with their eyes, and choose to acknowledge what is happening in our country. Justice Montoya-Lewis, I do believe that all things happen for a good reason. And I had prepared this really long speech for today, and then I listened to your address. And I realized that we, the ones who have survived, we, the ones who carry the living blood of those believed to be vanquished, are able to speak. And so I will share some of what I prepared, for we have much in common about our journeys. We began our time together by acknowledging the lands that we stand on and live yesterday. We acknowledge the earth that sustains us and the indigenous people whose creation stories are tied closely to the land and the stewardship of that land and those who still walk among us. There is power in the act of acknowledging truth. So I appreciate that that is how we as a community chose to start out our time together. It is said that the victors get to write the history books, but I contend that whoever said that forgot to also mention that we, the living blood of those presumed to be vanquished, and our allies who choose to see with their eyes, we are still here, and we will speak the truth and remember from whence we came. And for that, today, I lift up the ancestors, our ancestors, whose fight for dignity within families started on these lands centuries ago. Justice Montoya-Lewis, there's research by Wilderman and Wolfogel and Leventhal. These researchers documented that the people we are descended from are the most likely to have child welfare involvement. Native children, 15% of Native children will enter the child welfare system before age 18. The number for Black children is 11%. Those numbers should terrify us. And that's what brings us here together today, because though we are physically apart, we are in fact joined in our purpose. So I ask that each of you today, wherever you are, you take a moment and say it out loud. Say this out loud with me. I am here. I am here, standing strong in this work, and I am not alone. For we are not alone. We've joined together over the last 2 days to learn from each other, to hear the stories that we know are not ours alone. And so today I start by acknowledging the parents who are in this fight because they have no choice. They did not have a choice at the beginning. They're in this fight because of their children, because of their families. They are in the fight of their lives. Many of these parents decided that once they were done with child welfare involvement, that they would return as advocates because they understood the conditions that resulted in their involvement persisted. And so many other parents would be swept up in the family separation appetite. It's a voracious appetite. I salute each and every one of you, the social workers, the attorneys, the parent advocates who are here today. To you, I say, quoting from a very wise character in the Avatar movie, Nala, I see you. And how are you? I hope that you have been well. I hope that in this time of a pandemic, in this COVID time, that your families are safe and you are well. I hope that you have fed yourself nutritious and tasty food and that you have moved your bodies during this time we were told to stay in place. I hope that you have been surrounded by people who you love and who love you and who can care for you on the days that you need it most. The work that you do is difficult. The work that we do is difficult, and some days more so than others. So I hope that you are not working in isolation. I hope that you are leaning on your teams, because as the research out of New York City's family representation programs teaches us, when we work together, we are better. We get children home sooner. We make this process that we currently live in less traumatic for families. So I hope you have been able to work with those closest to you. I remember the first time I came to one of the conferences, the family representation conferences, and I thought to myself, I think I found my tribe. Because it's in these spaces that the gaslighting stops. Today, we heard from Dr. Dorothy Roberts. And Dr. Roberts, I remember the first time I read one of her articles. I had chosen to work with parents. I'd chosen to speak to parents to understand their truth, and the pushback was immense. But I refused to stop because I believe that parents are in the best position to help their children. I don't think a system can replace a parent. I haven't seen it been done successfully yet, and I don't expect to. So when I read Dr. Roberts' words that talked about the replication of apartheid, that family courts, looking at the family courts, looked like walking into South African apartheid, I thought, okay, I can breathe now. Because when I went to the Bronx Family Court for the first time, I was shaking. Also, I think the police that were there, who were armed and uniformed, were quite confused about this Black woman walking in and going into the non-Black line. They didn't know quite what to do with me. Interesting to walk into these spaces. But Dr. Roberts also encouraged us today to think about how we set aside a system and move forward. She invited us to leave behind what does not serve us any longer and envision a better tomorrow. Yesterday, Marty Guggenheim brought the fire. I was a little jealous, very honestly. I like to bring the fire. I've been asked to bring you hope today. And so when Marty started talking his truth, speaking his truth, I found myself shouting out loud several times because I felt validated, and I hope that you did too. The gaslighting that happens in child welfare, the child regulation, family regulation system is real. It is so real. I hope that through the presentations, the plenaries, the chats, the opportunities for collaboration and networking, that you too have found that you saw your reality of working with parents reflected here. This conference is intended to reignite your passion, because your passion is necessary, it is essential, it is what keeps us going. Though I wanted to bring the fire today, I was reminded by a friend of mine that, in fact, there must be something after the fire. and that after the fire burns, it's from the charred earth that the greenest forests will grow. And so today, I make an effort to take us through the forest. And in order to do that, I find myself going back, just as Justice Montoya-Lewis did. And Justice Montoya-Lewis, I give honor to one of the scholars that I've learned so deeply from, Dr. Karina Walters, herself an Indigenous scholar, a Native scholar. And she also is in Washington at the University of Washington. She cautions us so that whenever we speak of the trauma and the pain that our people have been through, the historical trauma, the legacy that we carry with us in our bodies, in our minds, that we also remember to talk about the great and the tremendous cultural wealth that we carry, for balance is needed in all things. And so in order to do this, we sometimes have to walk the footsteps of our ancestors, of those who have gone before us, because it's possible that through walking those footsteps, we can find our way. And so in order to do that, in order to bring a message of hope, I found myself going back to my ancestral familial lands. I reflected on the stories handed down to me and my own lived experiences. And this is what came to me. In spite of the hardest of times we experience within our families, with kindness and love, we can find our way. So I invite you, as I share my story, to acknowledge your ancestral familial lands. And I ask that you remember that this space is as old as time, and it has so very much to offer. I first start out with great humility by acknowledging the privilege that I have as a Black woman in knowing where I come from. The stories of my ancestors, that they survived the intentional rending of families, the purposeful centuries-long practice of tearing families apart during the institution of slavery, is no small feat. And for this, I am truly grateful. These stories help to give me roots so that I can sprout the wings that my ancestors believed I had before they even knew to think of me. I come from a family of laborers, of horsemen, of farmers who owned their land. My great-grandfather insisted that all of his girl children be educated. And this was during a time when stopping at primary school would have been totally acceptable. But he refused. He educated them all. I come from a family of shopkeepers, postmistresses, waitresses, and a giant man who was both a boxer and a baker. I sit with you today to speak as a Black woman first, an immigrant, and a proud New Yorker. I sit with you today to speak as a woman living within a society that for centuries indoctrinated within law and within interactions between human beings, that the people I just talked about, the people I call family, are 3/5 of a human, not quite human enough. From this ancestral familial place, I call forward and acknowledge explicitly that though this 3/5 mandate left its legacy of trauma and pain, of which many families, and Justice Montoya-Lewis, that resonated with me deeply, your family's story, who live with historical trauma, and I know mine certainly does. I call forth and I acknowledge explicitly that there is still no way that we could have made it without love without faith and a belief in our own worth and value, and a firm belief in a better tomorrow. I honor our collective ancestors and mine specifically, who in the face of great despair, dared to believe and dared to love. For I believe this to be true. It would have been impossible to come this far without love. I greet you today in the name of Daphne, the shopkeeper, postmistress, teacher, and elder in her village. I remember sitting and watching quietly at the end of the evening as she wrapped food in brown parchment paper, because there were no plastic bags then, for the people who came quietly at the end of the day after the bustle had died down. They stood quietly at the shop door and they asked her if they could have some food. They came with hunger in their bellies and no money in their pockets. And Daphne would pull out the ledger and she would write down what she gave them. And she always gave them extra every time. She never wrote down the extra. And there was not a line in that ledger for anything owed for the kindness that she showed. I speak to you of Edith, who raised 5 children. While she was raising those children, she was fortunate. She owned the land and the house she lived in. And so she had renters. But at the end of the month, oftentimes they had no money to pay. You see, in post-colonial Jamaica, we had gotten freedom, but wages were depressed. And so after long hours of labor, people had little to show for it. Funny how that sounds like 2021 in the richest country in the world. Edith's tenants and Daphne's customers would say to them in different degrees of this, they say, when they got some money, they would pay. And both women knew money was scarce, so they may never get paid. These women chose to give from what they had. I greet you in the name of these women, my grandmothers, fierce, determined, and directed women who chose to treat the people in their communities with kindness. You may be wondering, what do these stories have to do with where we are now? And I will offer you that love and kindness. The loving kindness that lived in our communities when we still had little. The loving kindness that was shown by the windowsill aunties who lived in Harlem and in different parts, different cities around the country, that loving kindness is what we need at the core of all of our interactions with families. Showing up for our families makes a difference. And yesterday, Associate Commissioner Schomburg showed up and said to us that the Biden administration is listening. And so, Commissioner Schomburg, I was heartened to hear that you talked about racism explicitly. It's been a long time coming. Racism, and in many ways, anti-Black racism, especially in the cities where we abound, is alive and well. I heard you talk about all the initiatives that are underway, and I want you to go back to say, on the ground, we are still fighting fire. We are still losing children to the system at a pace that should terrify each and every one of us. We still have families that are involved with the child welfare system generations deep. I pray, I ask you to take this message back. A system that is involved with a family for 4 generations cannot claim to be helping that family. That system can only claim to have successfully replicated the need for itself over and over again. There is hope that you are listening, and I see hope in the dignity with which the child credit has been dispersed or will be dispersed, because frankly, it's insulting to try to tell a poor mother or father how to spend money. It is insulting. They usually don't have money to spend, so telling them how to budget, that's not going to do it. I appreciate that there is a credit per child and that parents are not being made to prove that they need this money. It is simply being given for them to use at their discretion. I hope that parents will now be able to save, or if they choose, to be able to go and shop for nutritious food for their children, because perhaps the closest place to them has the lowest quality and the highest price. Perhaps they will buy back their time so that they can spend their time with children, because as we've learned from the research, the biggest deterrent to behavioral problem for children is time spent with their parents. But if their parents are working constantly, if their caregivers are working constantly, then that's the least commodity they have is time. So that this was done in such a respectful manner gives me hope. So in closing, and I know I have only about 7 minutes to go, I wanted to talk to you about some of the things that give me hope, that keep my hope going. And one of those things is my core belief in parents. I believe that parents are best positioned to care for their children. And those who are having a hard time, as many of our child welfare involved families do, they need support. And if we give them that support without humiliation, and let me underscore that again, without humiliation, then they will rise to the occasion, because it's their children. I know that there are examples that will be thrown our way that says that, we don't care about kids, and I would venture to say that is wrong. Actually, more than venture to say that is wrong. I think we do care deeply about kids. And we know that their parents care about them even more than we do. And we don't assume to replace their parents, because we know we cannot. And so we humbly serve them. We humbly keep our place and respect their place in their families. I'm going to share with you very briefly the findings from a study that I just did in New York City. Many of you in New York participated, and we thank you again. The article will be coming out in Family Court Review in a couple of months. I tried to get it to share with you beforehand, but I'm sorry, academia, the struggle is real. No one wants to release it until it's out there. But I will send a link in our shared chat or shared listserv once it's available. So kindness and love in the courtroom is well aligned with the tenets of therapeutic jurisprudence. We can help families without humiliating them. We can do basic things like speaking to them directly, calling them by name, making space for them to share their stories, their narratives, just as Montoya, as you said. Where are they coming from? They are real people. They are not 3/5 of a person. We can build relationships with them so that they don't have to show up as perfect. We can get to know them. I hope that the judges on whom much of this is published, their behaviors, do read it and hear it. Because we didn't find good judges and bad judges. We thought we found authoritarian judges and rubber stamping judges. But we also saw that people who were authoritarian could engage in good judging behaviors. We can also refuse to participate in the rending of the parental role in the spaces in which we operate. And so I asked that we stop referring to parents in anything as birth parents. I don't think that qualification is necessary. I believe the only person in this world who can refute a parental relationship or refuse it is that child. I come from a culture that does not acknowledge termination of parental rights. I didn't understand those words the first time I heard them, and I refuse to understand them now. I don't know how that is possible. I think if a child decides that they're going to walk away for a little while because whatever it happened, it's too much, perhaps then we could say termination. And even then it might be just a suspension, because it's amazing how people do try to work things out over time. And that the hundreds of thousands of dollars that are spent on separating families, what I saw in 2014 was those adult children going back to find their parents and bringing their babies to their mothers who were not allowed to raise them, but they took them to their mothers for Sunday dinner, for childcare, for respite care. Hundreds of thousands of dollars later, they went back. So I ask that we not engage. I say we push back. I say we engage in language that asserts the rights of parents. And a final note, when we talk about abolition, I listened closely today and I thought, why are we arguing about the term abolition? I'm glad to use the term abolition. It's been used in terms of things like slavery. What am I going to do? Mitigate slavery? Talk to it nicely? No, I don't want to. I want to abolish it. Let us not be confused by people who would distract you. I'm off my speech now. But I'm speaking from what I think we all feel. We abolish things that break people. We stand proudly by that. We abolish the system that is breaking families. We don't need it. We need something else. We need dignity. We need love. We need kindness. And so in closing, I hope that you have been nourished in the last 2 half days, like a full day altogether. I hope you're feeling energized, replenished, and your focus sharpened, and that you walk away from this feeling renewed and purposeful. And remember Kindness is always a good choice. It's always welcomed. So when you have that interaction with the next parent, choose kindness.
Tricia, I told you I was going to cry. I was trying not to. Thank you so much to both you and Justice Montoya-Lewis. I can't think of two better people to close us out and move us all to the next level of advocacy. Tricia, I wanted to share a few of the chats with you because I know you didn't get to see them, and there is no doubt you brought both fire and hope. So one person wrote, "I am standing strong in the work. We are not alone. #togetherness. You're bringing fire right now too. It's a long-lasting kind. These stories are hitting the heart and will remain in the mind, direct and guide. This session should be required watching for every high school in the country. Thank you. I thought of Ms. Ida, an elder, when I was growing up, who sat on her porch with her sunglasses, watching us kids. If it moved, she saw it and reported to our parent when they got home from work of all of our misdeeds. I so appreciate your words. Thank you again." And finally, someone shared that this conference has reminded me that we are fighting together to gain justice all over the country every day. So usually at this point of the conference, I feel a little bit blue that it's over and we won't be together again for 2 years. Today, I'm feeling grateful that technology worked and we could learn and be inspired together at a distance. And then in just 11 months, we'll be together again in person, which means, oh my gosh, I better start getting planning. So please look for our workshop request for proposals by the fall. And please plan to join us in Virginia on April 7th and 8th, 2022. As I put in the chat, the materials and recordings will be available to you for the next 30 days. You just use the same link and click on the tile and you'll find what you need. Please complete your evaluation survey so our planning committee knows what ideas you have for us going forward. Thank you again to our steering committee, Casey Family Programs, Vision Digital, our speakers, and especially all of you for your active participation. We do believe in freedom and we will not rest. I'll see you in April.